It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
Hello, my guest today is Dr. John Studdard, pulmonary and critical care physician for nearly 40 years. Dr. Studdard earned his undergraduate and medical degrees at the University of Mississippi and completed internal medicine residency and fellowship training in pulmonary critical care medicine at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. He has demonstrated exceptional leadership and service through numerous roles with the American College of Chest Physicians, including chest president in 2017 and 2 terms as the foundation president. Additionally, his dedication to reducing tobacco-related illnesses led him to represent chest during the historic 1998 negotiations with the tobacco industry, which resulted in the landmark Attorneys General Master Settlement Agreement. Dr. Studdard, welcome to the podcast.
Leon, thank you for having me. And thank you for your recent book.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope you enjoy it. I had a lot of fun working on it, and I really like how it came out.
You hit a home run with me because my background is different than yours, and then a lot of folks that have had the opportunities I've gotten to have in leadership like of chest, and that I came from a private practice background, and yet the lack of physician education and leadership is so obvious in the world that I lived in professionally for over 40 years. So your book is greatly appreciated, even though you came from a background where leadership was drilled into you guys from the beginning of your undergraduate education. But thank you for your book. It's well written, it's commonsensual, and I'm a huge believer in better patient outcomes.
Yeah, I've told folks over the years that whenever I've been in senior leadership positions, on the back of my door, I have a single sheet of butcher block paper, and it's blank except for a big arrow I've drawn at the bottom that points to better patient outcomes. And I said, to whatever proposal you're coming to me with as a leader in this organization, I want you to get me to that point. So really everything that we do is about that. And the book is very definitive about drawing that straight line between physician leadership, team performance, and patient outcomes, which is ultimately why we do what we do, right?
Exactly. Hopefully.
That's right. Well, listen, born and raised in Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken. How did you decide to start a career in medicine?
You know, that's interesting. My father, who actually served, as you did, in the armed services, he was in the Air Corps of the Army and served in World War II. And he was a very traditional Southern person. I won't say gentleman necessarily. He probably shouldn't have been to me. He was to my older brother, who was much more compliant than I was. But he was in the heavy equipment business, no college education, and I always told my older brother and I that we were going to be physicians when we grew up because we needed to be our own boss. And my father's been dead a number of years now, and I frequently told him, but I'm sure he didn't listen after I started practicing, that if you're a good physician, you're not your own boss, so the patient should be your boss. It's like any other career. I'm sure it's got a great upside and occasional downside here and there, but not a whole lot. But that's kind of how I got interested in medicine, because I was kind of told that he would help pay for my education if I were to be a physician, and follow his rules, which I told him I'd be a physician, but I did not promise, and he knew I wouldn't keep that promise, follow all of his rules. And again, I went to medical school here in Jackson, where my wife and I were both raised. My father-in-law was a general surgeon in the community. He had trained at Mayo and then in MD Anderson. My mother-in-law actually grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, and his dad was one of the first internists with the Mayos at the Mayo Clinic. So it's kind of, even though I interviewed a lot of places, that's kind of how I found my way there when I left Mississippi.
Oh, that's awesome. You mentioned the Mayos, and obviously tons of history there. I remember when we were doing a big move at Walter Reed, we uncovered a lot of documents in closets, and one of them was the original certification of Walter Reed Army Hospital by the American College of Surgeons, the first year that they had given these certifications to hospitals, signed both the Mayo brothers'
Wow.
signatures on
Wow.
that piece of paper. So
That's pretty awesome.
going back in the historical finds category. Fun
It was
stuff.
a great place to train and great people, great part of the world. Minnesota is a wonderful state, and it was just a great 5 years in for me, 3 + 2, before they went to a 3-year fellowship in pulmonary critical care. And it was a hard place to leave after 5 years. But the cold weather helped to push both my wife and I together back home. And we looked around a little bit at every point and every decision we had to make, stayed there for the 5 years, and decided to come back into private practice. I promised people at the Mayo Clinic if I could do more clinical time in my pulmonary fellowship. A gentleman by the name of Leo Black, who was chairman of the Board of Governors then in Rochester, I'd said, Dr. Black, I promise I won't ever embarrass you by going into academic medicine because I hadn't spent enough time in the lab. But so I never did go into academic medicine. A lot of times I wish I had, because I do love to teach. And I had very little education in that as I did in leadership.
Well, I would bet dollars to donuts that you would not have embarrassed anyone as an academic clinician looking at your history and record. So congratulations on all you've done.
Well, thanks.
How does that experience going back home and living in Mississippi nearly your entire life, save for training, does that give you a perspective on healthcare in general, the medical profession, that you could share with us?
I would like to think that it does. Being raised in Mississippi, I think it has a lot of impact on me now, and I presume it did through my whole lifetime. I'm 72 now. I don't have a great memory of, when you start out in practice, you're trying so hard to begin a family, raise a family, support your family, make a living. And, in private practice, if you're not working, you're not making money and you're still paying overhead. But, the perspective of growing up in the 60s in Mississippi is a powerful influencer on me then. And it's an incredibly powerful influence right now as I get towards probably the end of my life over the next decade to 20 years or whatever, as far as hoping to try to make a difference. And that's kind of what drives me in some of the things I do now. I grew up in a world where we were struggling with integration of education. We were struggling with social integration, of course, in the Deep South, like we were in the whole country. There were powerful impressions for me, Leon, of people who I felt were really good people. And in retrospect, I think they were really good people who stayed silent on very important issues. And that theme is something that kind of drives me now every day. I've never been one to keep my opinion to myself. I'm not very good at that. And that's not always the best building block for effective leadership, I know. And yet that whole Southern experience of the 60s was a powerful one, because I didn't grow up in a home that was real open-minded about race and those kinds of issues, and went to undergraduate at University of Mississippi, where, my goodness, we didn't have the first African-American student to matriculate at Ole Miss until the early 60s, and led to a riot in Oxford, Mississippi. And all of those things were just, those are powerful emotional memories for me. So I guess that probably, it had much of an influence on how I practice medicine. But, it's hard in the South. If you're even in a community hospital, we saw a lot of uninsured patients, a lot of patients with Medicaid, a lot of patients who did not have Medicaid. It was obvious then, but not as, I didn't really put it together as much as I have, I think, in the last 3 to 5 years, how much of an impact social drivers of health, social determinants of health have an impact on what we're trying to do in medicine, certainly at the community level. I know in the military, it would seem like y'all are a little more controlled in that population. You kind of define all the social drivers for those people once they get there. But for us, the issues of trust and education level, health literacy, access to adequate insurance or insurance at all, whether that's Medicaid, Medicare, or private insurance. I mean, we saw that every day in our practice. And fortunately, I worked with a great group of people that were willing to let anybody do anything they want if they realized that basically it only really impacted what I took home to my family if I was seeing a larger uninsured population, perhaps than others in the group. Nobody really ever asked about that. So that was a positive situation. But, the Mayo experience was incredibly important for me going home. Jackson was pretty unique then. We had a number of really bright people. That's implying that I'm bright. I shouldn't do that.
I think we'll check
other
that
people
box
then were
easily.
pretty damn bright that were coming back from really great places, from Hopkins, from UAB, from Vanderbilt. They were coming home to Mississippi to practice. And I thought we really had a exceptional medical community here back 40 years ago. I still think we have a pretty good medical community, but it was really good then. And I think we all kind of fed off of each other. And it was an exciting time in Mississippi, too, in the 76 to 81, in the early 80s, because we were finally making some progress, albeit slow, in social issues in our state. But the Lord, we're still fighting those issues, which we can talk about more later if you would like. So.
Yeah, we'll definitely catch up on some of the new and exciting things that you're doing a little bit further along. So, looking at that trend too, you talked a little bit about medicine and the social challenges that persist till today. Focusing on pulmonary, I remember starting my residency training and we were just getting one of the first MRIs. Things have changed so much in just my practice years. Look at your scope. What do you see as some of the biggest things?
Leon, when I was on the GI
So.
rotation at Mayo, our radiologists were coming up and saying, we're doing the CT imaging on the brain, but we want any of your, then a lot of people got admitted that now would be sent to the outpatient arena. But chronic abdominal pain, any of these people that are getting admitted, we want to CT abdomens for no charge because we have no idea what to do with all this yet. So, I mean, I'm an old guy, so that's hard to believe. And then not long after I got in practice, a big positive in pulmonary space, as you'll realize, was in laparoscopic cholecystectomy. That was almost an old-timey cholecystectomy was almost harder for severe pulmonary disease patients to get over than a thoracotomy.
Sure.
With that big subcostal incision for cholecystectomy. So laparoscopic surgery came into play and just exploded in the 80s, and that was huge. How good of a living you could make in private practice in pulmonary medicine also was how well you could get along with your cardiovascular surgeons. Because, of course, in those days, in the 80s and early 90s, any coronary disease ended up going to the operating room because they weren't able to do what we're able to do now, less invasively in a cath lab. And, we saw all of those post-ops, and that cardiovascular post-op suite was always overflowing because those guys were just cranking out surgery at that point. As a thoracic surgeon taught me at the Mayo Clinic, a guy named Pete Paralero, a great guy, great teacher, great thoracic surgeon, said, John, you need to be sure you make friends with the vascular surgeons, the cardiac surgeons, and the thoracic surgeons, because all of their patients, most of them smoke. And y'all are all taking care of, generally, to a large degree, the same patient population. So, golly, the changes in medicine from the early 80s or late 70s when I was training to the early 80s and now, it's just young people don't want to even waste time hearing about it, Leon. So they don't really believe it. I mean, you'll remember these days, Leon, even though you're pediatric neurosurgery, the first thing I would always do, I'm an early bird. I'd get to the hospital about 6. I love seeing my critical care staff that was there during the night because I felt like I got a better report from them than the crew that got there during the day. I usually knew more about their patients than they did at that point, much to their chagrin. And but the first time we'd go make rounds in the ICU, looking at all the x-rays which were there in the unit, but we're in a room where we had all the x-rays. And then I'd go, before I made rounds on the floor, I'd go to radiology. My older brother was a radiologist in the hospital that I predominantly practiced in then. But one of the radiologists would come out and you'd look at all your films together with a radiologist at your side. And they could say, well, we saw that, blah, blah, blah. And you could say, well, that's been there 5 years. And the back and forth created friendships, relationships, and much better patient care, I would argue, than today when you're throwing images up on a computer and reading a radiologist's report, perhaps, and cut and pasting it to a EMR, which I'm not a huge fan of, but because I'm an old man. So.
Yeah, we certainly struggle with those. The days when I could write a quick soap note and scribble a prescription and move the patient along are never to return.
And where the notes were from my surgeon, Leon Moores, and his pulmonologist, John Studdard, where you basically could say in your note, John, I'm concerned about blank or you. And if you weren't going to see him because you were going to be in the OR, you could communicate in the progress record. Now it's first became a document of billing, and then it's now become, I don't know what it is, a document on now, but
it's a long document is what we find, for sure.
Excessively cut and paste long document for the last decade of my career. So.
Yeah, you were talking about the following up the cardiac surgery patients, and as the recipient of a cabbage myself, having a pulmonary critical care doctor in my house, making sure I was using my incentive spirometer and taking
that was
deep
brilliant.
breaths, and was a unique experience, but it worked out. It worked out well to have her there.
What you tell me today, Leon, I won't mention to Lisa.
Vietnamese.
I forgot about that experience for you. So,
big open question. Anything you do differently looking back at this career that you've had?
Perhaps done an extra year of pulmonary and stayed at the Mayo Clinic. No, I mean, that's honest. I always
it was a great place.
That for the whole time I practiced that. I mean, we had good people with intellectual stimulation, but private practice done well is incredibly efficient. And that efficiency is good in medicine. On the other hand, education and questioning one another, and that whole phenomenon of the academic setting of academic stimulation, questioning, and defending, you don't get as much in private practice. So, really until my opportunity to be able to be in the leadership of the national organization, that was until Mayo, it was the most stimulating academic experience of my career, working with people like your wife and other great people in that space that predominantly in leadership were people with academic backgrounds. And it was just that was 10 or 15 years ago, but it was a change for me and was so rewarding for me. I got so much more from those 10 or 15 years of being in the foundation leadership and then the college than I gave them. It was incredible. So what would I have done differently? I might have considered, I almost went into a practice that was kind of half private practice, academic, and kind of a hybrid thing related to University of Alabama that they had going on then. So I regret not having more of a role to teach. For a period of time in Jackson, our VA and university were real short-staffed. We went over and staffed the VA critical care and actually staffed their coronary care unit for a couple of years, 3 or 4 of us. And then towards the end of my career, as we developed contract relationships with our 2 private hospitals, we did it different ways, but for about 5 years, one of us would do critical care rounds in all the critical care units. We called them institutional rounds. And we'd have a PharmD, we'd have a respiratory therapist, we'd have a social worker, and we made rounds on every unit patient in the hospital in a few hours. I mean, we probably had 40-something critical care beds. And that became much more of a teaching back and forth, particularly our young PharmD. He was a star. Actually, I encouraged him, and he gave several sessions at our annual meeting. Went from here down to Tulane right before COVID to be head of PharmD in critical care at Tulane in New Orleans. But he was always pushing articles and questioning and disagreeing in an appropriate way. And so that was probably the most academic-like experience, and it was towards the end of my career. So regrets, sure. Non-regrets, Jackson, Mississippi was a great place to raise children. There's an incredible need in Mississippi for not for us to lose our brighter, not brightest, folks to come home to this state. Look, I'm a real believer in community, and I think we all have a responsibility to give back to the community that gave us experiences that shaped our lives. That's kind of what I'm trying to do nowadays.
True. That's awesome. Well said. I wanted to reflect, you mentioned efficiency as one point about private practice. Other things that are great about private practice, some of our younger listeners thinking about where they're going to head with their career. Tell us all the good things and how that's changed over the 40 years that you did it.
First of all, over the 40 years, I saw it change in that the younger people that came into practice for a period of time became less interested in, we had to manage our practice. I didn't have a practice manager. I essentially was that at Jackson Pulmonary for a while. We had secretaries who had more experience than others until we finally, 15 or 20 years ago, hired practice managers. But they wanted things to be, just give them their call schedule, be sure they got fairly reimbursed for the work that they were doing. And they didn't want to deal with the management of a group, which is pulmonary became a big business. We ended up with, I guess my group that I retired from has 14 or 15 pulmonologists now. And once you got past about 4, when there were 3 of us, there were never disagreements. We all worked way too hard. And nobody complained about somebody working harder than the other one. We all ended up within about 0.5% of each other at the end of every year. If you finished earlier one day, you'd go to the hospital and help out your partner who was just getting blasted. And it was easy. Then as the group gets bigger, it gets more difficult, more personalities. The multiples get higher that you're having to deal with as far as the business of medicine. But I think the younger generation in medicine, our children are a little bit older than y'all's probably. They're 40 and 41 and 43. I see it in them, but in some of the younger people, both in my experience with American College of Chest Physicians, but also in practice, there's a little different perspective on that. And to me, that's encouraging. They kind of act a little bit more like I thought we acted and had interest in things. But the efficiencies, I always told people at the Mayo Clinic, if I were a resident in critical care and I had a pulmonary critical care fellow and a staff, if I had an idea, it had to go all the way up that ladder. And then to ever get back, you never communicate. Well, Mayo was a pretty good environment in that, at least I felt like by the end of my pulmonary critical care fellowship, I knew everybody. And so I could communicate with staff directly. It wasn't like they felt like they couldn't communicate with me. I think maybe I created an element of trust, or they felt sorry for me. But, just the efficiency of communication in private practice I'm sitting there in the ICU in the morning, the thoracic surgeon or general surgeon, neurosurgeon walks in the door, and I'll say, well, this happened last night. We're doing this, we're doing that, particularly neurosurgery. Y'all are so weird. That's
guilty.
Y'all, not y'all as people, but y'all as science is so different than everything else we do in a lot of ways. look, I was at the end of my second year of my medicine residency, and I'd had all the tough rotations, all the critical care, pulmonary, cardiology, GI. And then I went in to do 3 months of neurology, and I felt like I was right out of medical school again. Because there was Thor Sunt and Pete Grass and all these, well-known neurosurgeons.
Some of the giants, yes.
Thor Sunt, and they were all such gentlemen and so intense and so easy to work with, but there was so much we didn't know because neurosurgery is weird. But your communication there was down the ladder and up the ladder. And so and in private practice, you're working with these people side by side and day in and day out. Early on when I started, anesthesia was still doing some of the critical care. We began to take over more and more of that, and anesthesia disappeared to the operating room. Before that, maybe your younger people don't know, but anesthesia did a lot of critical care. And anesthesia does a lot of critical care now, but usually they're critical care docs. So, we'll still see in the units, we'll see our general surgeons and cardiologists and other people. Cardiologists want to spend their time in the cath lab and private practice, so they're willing to let us take care of all the patients in the unit. So to me, that's unfortunate because I thought the teamwork of working together was part of what made it fun, and maybe leading that team, and sometimes being led in that team. I always argue, Leon, that a good leader can't lead if he doesn't have good followers. And so you have to respect that sometimes when you have to allow somebody else to lead and try to follow them, which isn't always easy with my personality. But
what's a common trait with hardworking, driven professionals in the field of medicine in particular? I tell folks I write about that and talk about it because I am one, and I can pull my own weight in terms of guilty behaviors, such as being a little overbearing at times, I suppose.
If I had to do things differently, I would probably modify my behavior some. Our world has changed a lot in what was accepted as somewhat normal behavior back 40 years ago. One of our neurosurgeons, a guy named Luke Hodges, used to make rounds with a cigarette on his chart cart. In 1981, he'd quit smoking to walk in the room. And I would always come along behind him because he was a friend of mine and take and throw away a cigarette. And he'd know where he'd gone when he came out of the room. But, I probably would have treated people with a little bit more courtesy and respect than I did. I wish I had. People thought I mellowed when I got older. Hopefully I did. People tell John Studdard stories sometimes in Jackson now, and I go, oh God, here we go again. What did I say? I don't even remember what I said.
So true, so true. Okay, John, hold on a bit. We'll take a break. Coming up next time on All Physicians Lead, Dr. John Studdard will discuss his passion for physician advocacy.
All physicians are advocates. If we're not I've said this a million times, if we're not advocates for our patients, I would argue I don't know that you should be a physician.
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.